I'm Joel Greenberg, and I'm running for Seminole County Tax Collector. I believe in a smarter, faster, and more efficient government.
The clip you just heard was recorded in the Orlando Sentinel studio in 2016, just one of numerous interviews of local candidates for office that the newspaper recorded during the busy campaign season. Like other newspapers across the country, the Sentinel takes local politics seriously and puts candidates on the record whenever possible, so they can be held to their promises later. Joel Greenberg was a political novice, and he was young. The incumbent he was running against had taken office just before Greenberg turned 4 years old. Still, that incumbent was in the midst of a controversy that left him vulnerable, and Greenberg, a child of wealth, was unusually well-funded for a local candidate. He arrived for his interview in a light green button-up shirt and a blue patterned tie. His pitch was simple: my opponent is corrupt and has been in office for too long. I'll modernize the tax collector's office, revamp its website, and make the services easier to find and use. He pledged to create a smartphone app and extend office hours. And he said he'd use a business-minded approach to fatten the county's coffers.
As your tax collector, I will increase the amount of tax revenue collected for the county by increasing the number of services offered. This is a win-win for everybody. Joel Greenberg, smarter, faster, more efficient government.
Greenberg was elected in an upset and promptly embarked on one of the most scandal-plagued terms in office in Central Florida's history. He engaged in real estate schemes, fought publicly with elected officials, doled out millions in questionable consulting fees to friends, stoked Islamophobia on Facebook, and drew a rebuke from the state's attorney general for allowing his workers, who are not police, to openly carry firearms. And, according to federal prosecutors, he also embezzled more than $400,000 from the office through a cryptocurrency scam. He did also update the website. It's pretty nice. Hello and welcome to Joel Greenberg, the man, the scandal, the players. Brought to you by the Orlando Sentinel. I'm your host, Jeff Weiner. Greenberg's time in office ended when he was arrested on a federal stalking charge last June, as part of an investigation that has now spawned 4 separate indictments and a total of 33 criminal charges. He's expected to strike a plea deal with prosecutors by May 15th. The case has attracted national attention because of its implications for Congressman Matt Gaetz, who reportedly is being investigated for potential sex trafficking offenses in a parallel investigation that emerged from the Greenberg probe. But we delved into Gaetz in the last episode. In this one, we're going to talk about Greenberg. Before he was a central figure in a national political scandal, he was a font of local controversies, a disruptor, a lightning rod, a rising star, and a cautionary tale. The first time Joel Greenberg's name appeared in the pages of the Orlando Sentinel, he was 15. Greenberg was one of several teenagers who had benefited from the mentorship of John Amici, who at the time played at center for the Orlando Magic.
Amici's no ordinary British sportsman, a basketball superstar with teams like Orlando Magic and the Utah Jazz in America. He's also studying for a doctorate in child psychology.
Amici retired from the sport in 2013 and has since gone on to become a psychologist and a workplace consultant. Sentinel columnist Brian Schmitz wrote about Joel and Amici in May of 2000. Joel's mother told Schmitz that the basketball player had helped improve her son's attitude and self-esteem. She called Joel her shining star, but said he needed, quote, more polishing, more buffing. She told the columnist that Joel had been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder as a toddler, then developed Tourette's syndrome. He later had issues with stealing, first from his parents, then from a store. He wound up in Operation Right Track, an Orlando boot camp counseling program for troubled young people, and was enrolled at the Florida Air Academy, a military boarding school in Melbourne. But it was the basketball star who seemed to have reached him, his mother said. Asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, young Joel's answer was strikingly simple. I want to be a good person. Greenberg grew up well off as the son of Andrew Greenberg, who started Greenberg Dental in the 1980s. The chain now has more than 90 offices across Florida. Joel Greenberg's name would next appear in the Sentinel's pages as a byline. He wrote several articles as a freelance reporter for the sports department, including features on local wakeboarders. He later got into radio, hosting the Joel Greenberg Show weekdays from 4 to 6 in the afternoon on Yahoo Sports Radio Orlando. He also got into advertising, forming a pair of companies, DG3 Media Group and DG3 Network, which specialized in outdoor, radio, and digital ads. The advertising venture was a success. By the time Greenberg sold DG3 Media Group in 2015, it had the biggest growth of any company in Central Florida, according to an annual list by Inc. magazine, having reported $8 million in revenues for the prior year. As for DG3 Network, the other of the two corporations, it fell into inactivity until Greenberg filed paperwork with the state to relaunch it within days of his initial arrest last June. Federal authorities now allege that he used the company and another to obtain more than $432,000 in fraudulent loans through a program meant to help small businesses hurt by the COVID-19 pandemic, in a scheme that led to a slate of additional charges against him, including bribery of a public official.
So a lot of people look at Joel Greenberg now and say, how did a guy like this ever get elected? And that is a completely valid question. I mean, the guy is basically a walking five-alarm fire. But the guy before him, a longtime tax collector named Ray Valdez, well, he was kind of a mess too.
That was Sentinel columnist Scott Maxwell, one of Florida's foremost chroniclers of messy politicians. Valdez, who Greenberg defeated to become Seminole's tax collector, had first been elected in 1988. By the time of the 2016 election season, he was one of the region's most established and longest-serving incumbents, having last been challenged in 2004. Greenberg, a 31-year-old political novice, at first blush seemed unlikely to unseat him. But Valdez had a vulnerability. He and his family members over his tenure had raked in profits by bidding on properties put up for auction after owners failed to pay taxes and then selling them later, and also by purchasing tax certificates from Valdez's office in order to collect interest on delinquent taxes. The transactions weren't illegal, and indeed the Florida Ethics Commission seemed to take no issue with them. But Valdez had narrowly survived his 2004 race, which came after the Sentinel first reported on the issue. Watchdogs described the behavior as questionable, and other local tax offices had policies forbidding it.
Valdez was mixing his personal finances with public office. I'm convinced Ray Valdez could have stayed in office if he had just agreed to stop. But Valdez refused and basically threw the door wide open for Joel.
Greenberg seized the opening. He denounced what Valdez and his family had been doing as disgusting. The Sentinel's Martin Comis covered the controversy and the race.
Joel Greenberg in his campaign, he kind of set himself up as a fresh new face. You know, at that time, there was this whole movement in 2016, as you remember, even going on the national elections with Donald Trump. There was kind of this movement to get fresh new faces, and that's what Joel Greenberg capitalized in.
Greenberg leaned on his advertising background, plastering billboards across the county with pictures of his face. He pulled off a stunning upset in the Republican primary, defeating Valdez. The victory all but handed him the office, since there was only a write-in candidate facing him on the November general election ballot.
I remember talking to Joel Greenberg after he won the Republican primary that August. I asked him, well, what do you think you won? You beat somebody who had been in office for about 30 years. And Joel, he said, his quote was, people are sick of crony capitalism and with politicians using their offices for political gain.
Greenberg took office in January 2017. By February, he was already bristling against the requirements and limitations of his position, and butting heads with his fellow elected officials. He felt his rent-free offices in the county administration building in Sanford were too grimy, so he moved his staff to a smaller, nicer office, agreeing to pay about $9,200 a month to rent the space. A few months later came the news that Greenberg intended to allow his employees to openly carry firearms, particularly workers whose job it was to seize property such as desks, chairs, computers, file cabinets, and phones from tax-delinquent properties. He portrayed it as a safety measure and as a cost savings, but Greenberg began to openly carry a gun himself while on the job. He also started wearing a badge that resembled those worn by law enforcement, as did members of his staff. Meanwhile, Seminole leaders were growing increasingly concerned by his spending. In addition to taking on the new lease, Greenberg had sent a letter to the county commission chairman saying he planned to hire 19 additional workers at a cost of more than $500,000. The conflict that emerged had to do with the relationship between the tax collector's office and the county. Greenberg's budget was overseen by the State Department of Revenue, not by county officials. But state law also requires tax collectors to balance their budgets each year, sending any excess revenue into the county coffers. Counties rely on that money. They make plans for it and craft their budgets with an expected amount in mind. But from Greenberg's perspective, it was, first and foremost, his to spend.
At the end of the year, my budget must be zeroed out. At the end of the budget year, I can't have any money left. So while I must zero out all of my bank accounts, I am not allowed to have any reserves either. It's just that simple. Any funds that we've earned, I'm required to distribute it as a gift to you. And the operative word is gift. Because had I said returned, it would have indicated that you had given it to me first, and I was simply returning it. I mentioned at the beginning that the tax collector's office does not impact your budget. I misspoke. The tax collector's office does impact your budget. Not in a negative manner, but in a positive manner.
That was Greenberg addressing Seminole County commissioners in August 2017. To say they disagreed with his philosophy would be an understatement. Keep in mind, these are dollars collected in taxes from Seminole County's residents. Here's an exchange with Commissioner Brenda Carey, who would emerge as a frequent critic of Greenberg. The third voice is John Horan, who was the commission's chairman.
In the private sector, which many of you are not familiar with, you can either have...
Many of us are.
Many of us are. You can have expansion, right, or you can be profitable. We're going to expansion mode, which will lead to further profits and greater profits, might I add.
Okay, so in 2 or 3 years, you're going to be returning $30 million to the county.
If you guys behave.
Legally.
Seriously?
Are we not behaving?
Mr. Chairman, I think we can end this presentation. We don't need to be insulted. I can't even believe...
Likewise.
I don't think that you've been insulted, Mr. Greenberg.
Days later, Greenberg, with his gun on his hip and his badge on his chest, served Carey with a trespass warning, barring her from entering his offices. He claimed she'd gone on a tirade during a personal visit to the office to transfer some license tags. She denied that. Greenberg butted heads with Seminole commissioners again after he unveiled plans for an elaborate real estate transaction. It involved selling off 4 of his branch offices for $13.2 million, then renting them back from the purchaser. With the cash from the sales, he planned to buy up several shopping centers along the Orange County border, rent out most of the units to businesses, but also open regional driver's license offices in the plazas. He argued the rent his office would collect from its tenants would more than cover the cost of renting back the branch offices he was selling. As Martin Comas can attest, commissioners were baffled.
Of course, the county really didn't like this idea. They didn't think it would work out, that it would just really just harm the county financially years down the road. So they convinced the State Department of Revenue to basically quash this idea.
The Joel Greenberg experience was strange from the start. Tax collectors generally don't play real estate mogul with taxpayer-owned buildings. They don't typically insult county commissioners or try to become shopping plaza landlords. They certainly don't usually carry guns or badges.
Joel Greenberg almost from the start developed a very adversarial, very almost like a cowboy manner. He wasn't like any of the other constitutional officers that tried to work in building better relations with the county commissioners and with other elected leaders in Seminole County.
But in December 2017, Greenberg's behavior crossed over from strange to disturbing. Using flashing lights on his dashboard and toting his tax collector badge, he pulled over a motorist driving alone in the middle of the night and scolded her for speeding. This was one of the incidents we mentioned in episode 1. The implications of what Greenberg had done were obvious to Scott Maxwell, the Sentinel columnist.
I think a lot of people, myself included, thought that looked a lot like impersonating a law enforcement officer, so there was an investigation, but the state attorney ultimately determined that he shouldn't be arrested.
Here's how Stacey Straub-Salmons, the chief assistant to State Attorney Phil Archer, explained the decision not to charge Greenberg with impersonating a police officer. Quote, "I will give Mr. Greenberg the benefit of the doubt and assume that his intentions were pure, in that he was trying to slow traffic in an attempt to make his community safer." Unquote. Maxwell had talked to Greenberg about the traffic stop and gotten an explanation that didn't exactly jibe with the prosecutor's charitable reading of the tax collector's intentions.
He was sick of people speeding around here and waking up the damn baby. That's his direct quote. He was referring to his baby.
As we detailed in the first episode, this was one of several incidents in which Greenberg's behavior in office appeared to toe the line of criminality, only for local or state authorities to opt against pursuing charges against him. Maxwell has a theory for why officials in position to intervene, at least those in Seminole County, again and again opted not to.
I think a lot of it has to do with Seminole County. Seminole County has long had a reputation for being a gang of politicians that really protect each other. You sometimes hear people refer to a good old boys network. Well, in Seminole, they were known as the Seminole Mafia. So these were all Republicans, all connected, sometimes politically, sometimes financially. And the general rule in Seminole was that Republicans stick together. And if there's a mess, you clean it up inside the family.
We haven't even touched on all of the controversies of Greenberg's less than 4-year tenure in office. He stoked Islamophobia in posts on Facebook, prompting protests outside his office. He launched a Bitcoin business within the agency he ran, which federal prosecutors now say was actually an elaborate scheme for embezzlement and money laundering. For Martin Comas, documenting the goings-on of the local tax office, a place best known to most residents as where they'd go to get a fishing permit or to renew a driver's license, became almost a full-time job.
I had been covering county government for almost, 15, 20 years, and I don't remember ever actually writing a story before Joel Greenberg took office, ever writing a story in any county that I covered about the tax collector's office. The tax collector's office, it's a very important position, but it's a very mundane position. However, when Joel Greenberg took over in January 2017, it was one controversy after the other, after the other, after the other. And it was almost like it just basically took a reporter full-time to cover that beat, to cover that office.
Greenberg apparently tired of the media scrutiny his behavior attracted. When he was pulled over for speeding by a Lake Mary police officer in January 2018, he tried to talk his way out of a ticket, telling the cop who'd stopped him that he hoped to avoid another negative headline.
I am baffled that a little bit of professional courtesy wasn't extended, and I understand that you both have jobs to do completely, and I respect that. If there's any way on earth, I'm just trying to stay off the front page of the damn newspaper, right? Tax collector gets a ticket. This is the type of political crap I have to deal with.
When the Sentinel learned that Greenberg, who once stopped and berated a motorist for driving too fast, had tried to leverage his title to avoid a citation, it was front-page news. Though Greenberg guessed the headline wrong. It was, Tax Collector Asks for Professional Courtesy After Speeding. Martin Comas wrote the story.
But again, it's just another example of how Joel Greenberg faced one controversy after the other. And here he was going 20 miles over the speed limit of 35 miles per hour on Sun Drive, and he was pulled over by Lake Mary Police Department, and he felt that as tax collector, he could talk his way out of getting a ticket. Unfortunately, he didn't.
Over 4 decades as a journalist, and nearly 2 as a Sentinel columnist, Lauren Ritchie employed a second-to-none radar for public officials in need of being taken to task. And though her column was mostly focused on Lake County when Greenberg took office, the Seminole County politician's behavior became a blip on her scanner early and often.
So I kind of kept a small eye, and then Martin Comas, the Sentinel reporter, did a story about him stopping a woman on the street and scolding her about speeding or supposed speeding. And when people start doing things like that, it's time to watch them. That's not normal.
Then, a tip arrived. The contracts being issued by Greenberg's office merited examination. So did the way the office was using credit cards. And digging through some emails might also bear fruit.
And just asking for the contracts, initially, Greenberg's office wanted literally thousands and thousands of dollars to check to let us take a look at the contracts. So that's when the battle started. And the Sentinel's lawyer called them and finally got them to acknowledge that that was ridiculous and, they would get us some of this stuff. So when he just went on and on about crony capitalism and how terrible it was, I'm thinking, that's what we need to look for. And with the help of a source who was better acquainted with Joel than any of us, we identified some of the folks in the photos and realized, oh my gosh, he's given millions of dollars to friends.
She began digging in the spring of 2019. That October, the bombshell dropped. Ritchie reported that Greenberg had doled out $3.5 million on more than a dozen outside consultants and new employees. Among them were Rick Sierra, a lawyer who'd been married to his aunt when Greenberg was growing up. Also on the payroll were 3 of his groomsmen, who'd collected a combined $640,000. Michael Shirley, a campaign consultant who helped Greenberg defeat Valdez, had gotten $678,000 for budget consulting, strategic planning, and technological advice. Other vaguely worded contracts promised transition services, branding, social media help, modernization of the office website, and reviewing information technology. A recent county audit was unable to find evidence that many of those hired by Greenberg in consulting roles had produced any work at all. His legal fees were also astronomical.
When I looked at his contracts, he had 4 or 5 lawyers, sometimes at the same time. And I said to him, Joel, how can you justify this to the taxpayers? How can you think that this is okay? I mean, there are tax collectors all over Florida who don't have any in-house lawyers. I mean, in Central Florida, that's certainly true.
Greenberg's defense of his actions, as it almost always was when called out for one thing or another, was to portray himself as a business-minded innovator destined to bring a windfall to Seminole County taxpayers, if only those without his disruptor's mindset would stay out of the way. Oh, and also, as almost always, it was Valdez's fault. This clip is from a sit-down interview Ritchie conducted with Greenberg.
One of the things that was not anticipated was the lack of transition and not having any knowledge of anything because of the way the relationship was between my predecessor and I. And when we came in, I had to surround myself with people that I have worked with in the private sector and had great success with. I wouldn't say it's crony capitalism, but we moved quickly, and outsourcing is a lot cheaper than hiring internally in many aspects. And there's something to be said for being able to outsource and being able to terminate a contract without having to worry about how litigious the society is with lawsuits. And it's easier to cancel a contract than it is to fire somebody.
In a subsequent column, Ritchie would expose another of the strangest Greenberg controversies. An IT worker for Greenberg's office claimed the tax collector had asked him several times to write and deploy a malware program that would lock up Seminole County government computers in order to demand $500,000 of Bitcoin in ransom, which the worker said Greenberg offered to split with him. The worker, Brent Tyler, said Greenberg didn't intend for him to release the hostage computers even after the ransom was paid. Tyler spoke to agents of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, but the agency opted not to pursue a case against Greenberg. The scheme allegedly was part of a vendetta against Brenda Carey, the commissioner who butted heads with Greenberg and who he once had banned from his offices.
He was very angry that he'd been treated as, I think he felt he was treated as a child. Now, young man. But I think what he never realized is that his behavior pretty much asked for that treatment. I'm sure it comes as a surprise, but Joel's actually kind of charming. He's boyish, he's self-deprecating. He sounds like a really nice guy. And I think a lot of people think that about him. I've heard friends say, come on, what are you doing? He's a decent fella. And I think that that's probably true until you really begin to explore things in depth with him and you realize that something's wrong. His reactions aren't typical. His viewpoint seems to lack a moral compass. And you begin to get to know him a little better and you go, ooh, yeah, there's a problem here.
In our last episode, we talked about Greenberg's fast friendship with Matt Gaetz, the Panhandle congressman who has reportedly become a target of the federal investigation into potential sex trafficking offenses. We also delved into Jason Pirozzolo, an Orlando doctor whose name has also surfaced in reports about the ongoing probe. Gaetz denies wrongdoing, and Pirozzolo has yet to comment. And in episodes to come, we'll talk about the network of power players that surrounded the former Seminole County tax collector, many of whom were at times on his payroll, including developer and lobbyist Chris Dorworth, Longwood City Commissioner Matt Morgan, and State Representative Anthony Sabatini, as well as his political allies in Sanford and Tallahassee. In Lauren Ritchie's view, these connections to power and influence weren't perks of the job for Greenberg. They were the root of its appeal to him. And that came at a steep cost for Greenberg, for Seminole taxpayers, and potentially for his powerful friends, too.
Joel very much wanted to be involved with all the big name folks, you know, the congressmen, the big developers, people like that. He wanted to be at the heart of the moving and shaking. And that's what really got him going and what he really liked. And if he had to be this boring old Seminole County tax collector in order to do it, then that's what he was going to do. And to me, it left him vulnerable, especially to friends. And it's just my opinion that some of his close friends took advantage not only of Joel, but of taxpayers in getting contracts and basically doing almost nothing for them, and in some cases, nothing at all.
When Ritchie left the Sentinel, she did so knowing there were many more stories to tell about Joel Greenberg.
When I retired a year ago, those were the only files that I left for somebody, because I knew that Joel would be coming up in the news again.
That's the end of this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. It was produced by the Sentinel's Wesley Alden and featured reporting from all the current and former Sentinel journalists you heard from. Next time, we'll delve deep into Greenberg and Gaetz' network of political allies from Seminole County to the state capitol, including those who spent time on the tax collector's payroll. And we'll continue to follow the latest developments in the broadening scandal. Thanks for listening. Please rate the podcast, subscribe, and tell your friends. And continue to follow our coverage of this saga at orlandosentinel.com/Greenberg.